We're very pleased that Professor Gillian Hart accepted our invitation to present this year's AAG Progress in Human Geography lecture. Professor Hart is Professor of Geography and Chair of Development Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. But before I do a proper introduction for Professor Hart, I would just like to take this opportunity to make a few announcements on behalf of the editors of Progress in Human Geography. The first is some good news about some prize winners. Every year, the Progress in Human Geography awards a Best Paper Prize to researchers who are defined as early career. There's usually about 6 to 12 papers in contention for this award. This year, there were 8 papers considered. The selection of the award winners is made by members of the editorial board. For 2015, there were 2 winners awarded for the high quality and originality of their papers. The first one was Brett Christophers from Uppsala University in Sweden, whose paper, The Territorial Fix, Price, Power and Profit in the Geographies of Markets, is an exceptional contribution. The second winner is Agnieszka Lesinski from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and her paper was titled Spatial Mediation. Again, another wonderful contribution which we're very proud to have in the journal. Each winner receives £130 worth of book orders from the catalogue of the journal's publisher, Sage. And the awards are announced at AAG here and also at the RGS IBG meetings, and a written announcement will also soon appear in the journal. So congratulations to Brett and Agnieszka. The second announcement is also good news, in part because it's to do with the change in the editorial team, and that's because I and Chris Philo are stepping down at the end of this year, and coming in our stead are 2 wonderful new editors. One is Professor Louise Amour, who's at the University of Durham, and she's known for her work on global geopolitics and security, looking at how contemporary forms of data, analytics, and algorithmic risk management are changing techniques of border control and security, amongst other things. So Louise Amour will be a great new editor for the journal. And we're also pleased to welcome Professor Nina Laurie, who was for a long time at Newcastle University, where she was Professor of Development and the Environment, and has recently relocated to the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And Nina's work is well known in development studies, in feminist theory, and in geographies of the developing South, including Latin America and Andean Latin America. So we welcome both Professor Louise Amour and Professor Nina Laurie to the team starting at the end of this year. The third announcement has to do with a recent tribute which our managing editor Noel Castry penned, remembering the life and tremendous contributions of Doreen Massey. And you can find that in the free part of the journal, along with some of Doreen's, well, in fact, all of Doreen's contributions that have ever appeared in Progress in Human Geography are there for you to look at without, they're not behind a paywall. It's an appreciation of the extraordinary depth, scope, and value of Doreen's contribution to geography, and we hope it will be of interest and value to our readers. But moving on from that sad news to the good news of Gillian Hart, who is here with us as our speaker this year. As I mentioned, she's based at the University of California, Berkeley, and she is also a distinguished professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. She earned her PhD in agricultural economics from Cornell University after undergraduate and master's degrees in economics from Rhodes University in South Africa. Professor Hart's early scholarship was focused on agrarian change and rice farming in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Malaysia, with particular attention paid to questions of gender, the household, labour, and power. The book, Power, Labour and Livelihood, Processes of Change in Rural Java, was the first major book that she published on these topics, but she followed it with an edited collection, Agrarian Transformations, Local Processes and a State in Southeast Asia, a bit later, along with numerous articles and chapters in a wide array of journals and collections reflecting these interests in agrarian change in Asia. I'll just give you one sample title of this work so that you can kind of get a flavour of the approach. From Rotten Wives to Good Mothers, Household Models and the Limits of Economism, which appeared in the Bulletin of the Institute of Development Studies and was reprinted in at least one major reader. Well, with the ending of apartheid in South Africa in 1994, Professor Hart seems to have turned her attention back to her native South Africa. And from then on, really, we see an amazing collection of careful work examining questions of land reform, agrarian change, industrialization policies, labor, and uneven development. Many in this room, I'm sure, will be familiar with her 2002 book, Disabling Globalization, Places of Power in Post-apartheid South Africa. One reviewer wrote of this book that he was struck especially by the imprint of Doreen Massey's theoretical ideas in shaping much of the directions taken in this work. And I think that's a nice connection between a person that we're remembering at these meetings and the ongoing scholarship in geography, and particularly Jill's work. Jill also, of course, draws from Lefebvre and other spatial thinkers to create her particularly relational, deeply relational accounts, which I guess we're going to hear more about today. I look forward to that. In her work, Hart draws upon ideas of relational space, and as I said, in the book about disabling globalization, she looked at two towns in South Africa to trace through ways in which South African society and economy was being restructured out of the ruins of apartheid and into a future of connection with different parts of the globe. It's a thoroughly geographical approach that she takes in that book to connect the dots, as it were, between places and people, processes and politics around South Africa and Asia in particular. In 2013, we saw a new book, Rethinking the South African Crisis, Nationalism, Populism and Hegemony, and it's kind of a sequel to the first book in a way. In this newer book, Professor Hart reflects on and analyzes the political turbulence of the past decade or so in South Africa. She, in her own words, goes beyond debates over neoliberalism to grasp the devastating dynamics of South Africa's racial capitalist order and how it has changed as it has become more fully incorporated into global circuits of accumulation. In that book, Professor Hart explores how de- and renationalization have occurred and are central to political hegemony. She gets her inspiration from Gramsci and also from Fanon to consider the kinds of political questions that are swirling around in South Africa, around questions of nationalism and, of course, populist movements of various kinds. Many of us will also know and appreciate Professor Hart's important contributions to development thinking. Her papers on development have certainly helped me think more clearly about development, big and little d, as she puts it. There's no doubt that Professor Hart's books and articles have enriched geography enormously and have impacted scholarship and thinking way beyond the discipline too. In addition to the publication track record, which is indeed impressive, I would just like to mention that Professor Hart, and I know this because I read her CV, Professor Hart reads many, many PhD dissertations every year. And I'm guessing some of you know this too. She's on an enormous number of students' committees. She regularly provides commentary in the press, and she's worked to build programs not just at Berkeley, but also at the former University of Durban-Westville and subsequently University of KwaZulu-Natal. And in fact, was just telling me that she's going to be building some partnerships with the University of the Witwatersrand as well. So without further ado, Professor Hart's lecture this afternoon is titled Relational Comparison Revisited, Thinking Through Interconnections. Please join me in congratulating Jill Hart on being honoured as this year's AAG Progress in Human Geography lecturer.
Sue, thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. And thank you also to Pauline for helping with all sorts of getting things set up. And to Rob Kitchen, who, what seems like many years ago, invited me to give this lecture. And it's actually a very auspicious year because it's the year I'm retiring. And, you know, maybe I decided to retire the year I was giving the Progress in Human Geography lecture. But I would also just like to say something about the process through which this lecture came into being. And when I realized I really had to get down to work on it, I sent around an email to graduate students and invited them to come and read with me. And at the beginning of the semester, there were, quite a few people, but it came down to a core rump who stayed on. But the group has included 3 wonderful graduate students, an equally wonderful undergraduate, and my very dear friend, Jean Lave. So it's been a fantastically sort of intergenerational, but also just incredibly collective process. And I have learned so much from these guys, it just isn't true. They've assured me that if I make any mistakes, that they will let me know. But I would say also that my gratitude to them goes beyond thanks, and all I can say is that I'll blame them for anything that goes wrong. So what is so important to me about giving this lecture is that for a long time I've wanted to revisit the idea of relational comparison, which grew out of the first phase of my work in post-apartheid South Africa. And what I also want to try to do is move beyond it a bit. But I want to start with the late Fernando Coronel, a wonderful Venezuelan historian, anthropologist. And I ended, the last paper I wrote on relational comparison was 10 years ago. And I ended it with Coronel. And I thought it would be appropriate to start this one with him. And what Coronel does is in a piece published called Beyond Occidentalism, published in 1996, he suggests that we focus attention on unsettling Occidentalism, understood not as the reverse of Orientalism, but rather as its condition of possibility, rooted in asymmetrical relations of global power that establish a specific bond between knowledge and power. And in this view, Occidentalism, as Coronel puts it, refers to an ensemble of representational practices that separate the world's components into bounded units, disaggregate their relational histories, turn difference into hierarchy, and naturalize these representations. And one of the things that's interesting about Coronel is he drew very heavily on Doreen Massey, as well as on Lefebvre. So he was another honorary geographer. So that even though, and what Coronel also does, is he goes on to show how many otherwise critical accounts of capitalism and colonialism often end up reinscribing what Jim Blount called the colonizer's model of the world. And even though I'm going to rethink aspects of relational comparison, I'm going to hold on to this original ambition of unsettling Occidentalism, which I found very inspiring. Now, in trying to make these moves, I've also been stimulated and provoked by a series of recent debates in both urban studies and subaltern studies that are cast in terms of Marxism versus post-structuralism / post-colonialism. And in both of these debates, which themselves resonate with each other, questions of comparison are actually front and center. But right at the outset, I really want to make clear that this lecture is absolutely not a manifesto. I'm not trying to prescribe what I think should be done. Rather, I want to do 2 things. First of all, to show what sort of analytical and methodological approaches I've found important, and also how I think they need to change in relation to changing circumstances. And secondly, I want to engage with the urban studies and subaltern studies debates to identify a set of what I see as affinities, differences, and productive tensions. But even though I'm not prescribing a manifesto, what I do want to insist on is the imperative for attending very closely to the simultaneous analytical, methodological, and very importantly, political stakes of how we formulate and use comparative strategies. And for me, comparative stakes are absolutely front and center and determine the analytical and methodological moves that I make. Now, political stakes, I think, are especially important since a lot of what travels under the banner of comparison is deeply retrograde. And Lisa Lowe, for example, has argued that it was actually with Weber that comparison became an institutionalized method for producing modern knowledge through the ideal type of Western rationality and deviations from it. She argues that it operated as an apparatus for apprehending and disciplining otherness, that this apparatus was mediated through a much longer history of colonialism, race, and slavery, and that it carried forward into the modernization studies of the post-war period. Now, at the same time, I found very compelling a comment by the historian Harry Harootunian, which is as follows. He says, "Peoples of the world outside of Euro-America have been forced to live lives comparatively by virtue of experiencing some form of colonization or subjection enforced by the specter of imperialism. The experience of living comparatively inevitably disclosed the instrumentalizing force of classificatory strategies promoted by the imperial dominant that invariably hierarchized relations everywhere colonialism and imperialism spread." So in other words, comparison can operate as a tool of oppression as well as, I think, and I hope, critical engagement. And with that in mind, I'm going to make 3 moves. First of all, I want to ask the question, what is the relational in relational comparison as I originally understood it? And I think this is actually a really important question, because what has become clear to me is what, in fact, a very baggy concept relationality is. There are multiple, often quite conflicting understandings of relational and relationality floating around, some of which are quite incommensurate with one another. There are also some interesting ways in which the idea of relational comparison has been picked up and used in urban studies, but there's also a wonderfully interesting piece by a woman by the name of Shu-Mei Shi in comparative literature at UCLA, who quite independently came up with this idea, and which is quite fascinating, and we're actually going to get together later this month. But to come back to the question, what is the relational in relational comparison? The short answer is this: it's dialectical. But not in the way most people think of dialectics, which is as a sort of a teleological Hegelian monster, slouching inexorably towards an appalling totalitarian totality that imposes uniformity on heterogeneity. And what I want to do is I want to reach out to those for whom the very term dialectics provokes a profound allergic reaction, and try to persuade them that actually there are ways of thinking about dialectics that are neither teleological nor totalizing, and that I think it provides a comparative analytic that is both methodologically useful and politically enabling. And secondly, as part of this process, I want to try to outline a move that I want to try to make from relational comparison to what I'm calling conjunctural comparison. And I'm going to try, and I'll explain how I'm going to try to do this. But really, the third move that I want to make is to bring this understanding of conjunctural comparison and really to try to push it further in conversation with the sharply polarized debates both in urban studies and subaltern studies. And I think it's very interesting how in her recent progress report, Kate Derrickson draws on Dipesh Chakrabarty's categories of History 1 and History 2 in Provincializing Europe to identify what she calls Urbanization 1 and Urbanization 2. And she defines urbanization, one, as the work of Neil Brenner, Christian Schmidt, and Andy Merrifield, who draw on Lefebvre and Marxist political economy more generally to make these sort of very mega claims about planetary urbanization. And she distinguishes that from those doing urbanization to, or urbanization from below, who draw on post-structural and post-colonial theory to, as she puts it, refuse Eurocentrism and provincialize urban theory that has grown out of European and North American cities. And especially in urban studies, what we've seen is a series of calls recently for a comparative analytics that will help to resolve these differences. But the real question, it seems to me, is what sort of comparative analytics can actually do this work? That's the key question. And I think Jenny Robinson's recent essay in Progress in Human Geography on thinking cities through elsewhere makes a crucially important point. And it seems to me what Jenny is saying is that questions of comparison really require us to go back to analytical basics. And she does this by drawing both on Lefebvre and on Deleuze. Now, I absolutely, totally agree with her about the need to go back to basics. And the way I'm going to do this is by trying to identify different concepts of relationality, including what I see as a non-teleological version of dialectics. Then what I'm going to try to do is point to affinities as well as differences and their political stakes, and think about how this might help us to move beyond the Marxism versus post-structuralism, post-colonialism formulation. And what I also want to do is engage with the subaltern studies debates provoked by Vivek Chibber's ferocious attack that's often also framed in terms of Marxism versus post-colonialism, post-structuralism. And Ananya Roy has shown very clearly how the urban studies and subaltern studies debates actually resonate closely with one another. And in this regard, I'm going to focus specifically on Chibber's attack on Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe. So I'm not talking about the whole of subaltern studies, just this particular text. What I'm going to do, in fact, is suggest that comparison, that conjunctural comparison, as I'm trying to reformulate it, in fact requires going beyond both Chibber and Chakrabarty. But before launching into these arguments, I want to say something briefly and schematically about where relational comparison came from, the work I needed it to do then, why I think it needs revision and extension in terms of conjunctural comparison to help me move in directions that I want to go. And these concrete engagements have shaped the arguments that I'm going to be making throughout the lecture. So the idea of relational comparison really grew out of the first phase of my research in post-apartheid South Africa, which was 1994 to 2000, 2001. But it goes back to the early 1990s when I returned to South Africa after having been away for nearly 20 years. And really, since then, I've just been utterly caught up in the twists and turns and vicissitudes of the post-apartheid, of the transition from apartheid, and really also trying to understand them in relation to forces at play in other regions of the world. And returning to South Africa, for me, also coincided with becoming a geographer after having been trained, as Sue points out, as an economist, although I like to think of myself as the rogue variety of economists, as Clifford Geertz said. But really, I was initially drawn into geography by the locality debates in the late 1980s, and went on from there to read Lefebvre and Massey and as much other geography literature as I could lay my hands on, including, of course, the work of very many people in this room. And I must say that as I got into geography, it quite literally blew my mind and gave me incredibly powerful tools to work with. And in 1994, immediately after the election that brought the African National Congress to power, I began to work in two former white towns and adjacent black townships, 100 kilometers apart. And thanks really to Doreen Massey's extroverted sense of place, which I'd recently read, I saw them not as towns or let alone cities or in fact any sort of bounded unit, but rather of points of coming together of three key processes. First of all, historical processes of racialized dispossession that then intensified in the apartheid era when millions of black South Africans were herded from what was defined as the white countryside to huge townships in the former Bantustans, many of them adjacent to small white towns. Second was apartheid projects of decentralizing industries to the borders of these areas to prevent black South Africans from migrating to metropolitan areas and also taking advantage of a captive labor force. And the third sort of key process was the movement of large numbers of small-scale Taiwanese industrialists into these areas since the early 1980s. And what I did was to set out to trace how these processes were changing in relation to one another in the transition from apartheid, and also to try to trace processes through which local governments were being, or the local state was being remade in this process. And I've been working in these places ever since, more or less intensively at different moments. And in one of them, my partner and I have sort of more or less become part of the furniture. We go back all the time, talk with people on the phone. Now, what initially drew me to these places in the early 1990s were expert knowledges that were invoking lessons from elsewhere for post-apartheid South Africa. And this was, of course, the World Bank and the IMF, but a whole bunch of other experts besides that. And two of these lessons that South Africa was being enjoined to learn from was firstly efforts to urge South Africa to emulate market-friendly East Asian miracles. And this was the precursor to discourses of neoliberal globalization, which by the mid-1990s were in full force. And the second was there was quite a fierce debate in the very early 1990s that was going on over whether South Africa's future should be metropolitan or whether it should be based on a revived peasant production through land redistribution. And what this debate totally ignored were these racialized spaces that were neither urban nor rural and that were pervasive throughout South Africa. And what they also ignored were the spatially extended lives of many South Africans. Now, instead of contesting these debates in more or less abstract terms, what I really wanted to try to do was to produce concrete counter-knowledges in a way that started from what was actually going on in South Africa. Now, the ANC's embrace of neoliberal economic policies really began in earnest in 1995, although officially in 1996. And over the second half of the 1990s, I watched with growing dismay sort of three key things going on in these places. Firstly, the collapse, really rapid collapse, of entire labor-intensive industries as cheap commodities started pouring in from China. Second was sharp cuts in central government spending on local government in the name of neoliberal austerity. And these are sharp cuts from the apartheid era. And what was going on was people who had paid low flat rates for water and electricity were all of a sudden having water and electricity metered and being charged much higher rates. And there was enormous conflict going on around this. The third thing that happened in this first phase of the apartheid, of the post-apartheid order, were the absolute ravages wrought by HIV/AIDS which was, in my view, a criminality on a mega scale. And during this period, what also became evident was that there was massive capital flight going on, as well as huge spending on an incredibly corrupt arms deal originally brokered by the apartheid state. And not surprisingly, by the early 2000s, there was a very significant upsurge in oppositional movements. And it was in this context that not just the idea, but also of relational comparison took shape, but also the way that I needed to sort of make it work. And I posited at the time relational comparison in opposition to two other methods of comparison. First of all, a positivist epistemology based on pre-given bounded units or cases, which is by far, of course, the most common form of comparison. And I was trying to think, is it 97% or 98%? It's somewhere up around there. And this, of course, includes Weberian methods, but much else besides. What I also rejected was the sort of approach that asserts a general process and then sees comparative cases just as variants of this process. And here's how I defined relational comparison. And I said, instead of comparing pre-existing objects, events, places, or identities, the focus is on how they are constituted in relation to one another through power-laden practices in the multiple interconnected arenas of everyday life. And clarifying these connections and mutual processes of constitution, as well as slippages, openings, and contradictions, could help to generate new understandings of the possibilities for social change. And as I'll discuss more fully, what really animated me was, again, the potential for relational understandings of the production of space and place to enable broader claims on the basis of in-depth historical ethnographies. And most importantly, what I tried to do was use relational comparison to engage political debates and political imperatives. And I think there were sort of three big arguments that grew out of this work. Firstly, I argued that in the post-apartheid period, that local government was emerging as a key site of contradictions, but also that it was constituted through, I showed how it was being constituted through entirely different political struggles and dynamics in two seemingly quite similar places, 100 kilometers apart. And what I suggested, that it was imperative for the left outside the ANC alliance, which was becoming increasingly disenchanted with the ANC, to take very seriously diverse but interconnected struggles in these local arenas, focusing both on specificities and, very importantly, also on interconnections. Now, second, what I tried to do was to use the connections with East Asia to call attention to how rapid industrialization in Taiwan and China had, in effect, been underwritten by redistributive land reforms. And then I tried to use this connection to help denaturalize the extreme forms of racialized dispossession in South Africa, as well as to challenge calls, which were very widespread at that time, for lowering wages in order to expand employment. And I argued that that was actually impossible given the way real wages operated. And then what I also tried to suggest was how these interconnections could be used to re-articulate the land question as far more than a rural or agrarian phenomenon. And together, these two, I argued, called into question impact models of globalization. The argument that globalization just sort of descends, the global descends on the local, and rather to focus very specifically on constitutive processes. And again, relational conceptions of the production of space were and remain absolutely central to both the analytical and the political stakes of relational comparison, along with critical ethnography, which I see as tightly connected with it. Now, 2001 was an absolutely key turning point in South Africa. And what emerged was new and, for me, utterly unexpected dynamics in the decade of the 2000s. Firstly, this was a period from the early 2000s onwards. There was rapidly increased government spending, both on social grants and on local government. At exactly the same time, struggles over local government increased dramatically. And I argue that local government went from being a to the key site of contradictions. Closely related to this, what we saw were proliferating expressions of popular discontent that very far exceeded the first round of oppositional new social movements, many of which collapsed pretty quickly, and by now many of them are pretty much defunct. And thirdly, multiple articulations of nationalism, both official and popular, in relation to one another as part of an absolute explosion of populist politics that was very, very different from what was going on in the first years of the post-apartheid order. And my sort of 2013-2014 book, Rethinking the South African Crisis, was an effort to try to come to grips with these processes. Now, the book is not explicitly comparative, but in writing it, I was constantly rubbing up against a series of Indian debates, including, but by no means limited to, subaltern studies. And every major argument that I made in that book really grew out of these implicit processes of thinking comparatively. I was also increasingly compelled, as I started reading more about India, by the parallel as well as divergent processes taking place in India and South Africa. And it seems to me that what we've seen in both India and South Africa since the early 1990s is the coincidence of three key dynamics. First of all, neoliberal forms of capitalism ushered in by the parties of liberation and unleashing rising inequality and quote-unquote surplus populations. Second is popular expressions of democracy that far exceed liberal democracy. And thirdly, escalating and proliferating expressions of nationalisms, and all of these entangled with gender power and shot through with race in South Africa and caste and communalism in India. And my interest in India intensified in 2014 when Modi took power, and what was significant about what's become to be called Moditva is that it exemplifies the rise of right-wing nationalisms in many different parts of the world, if not fascism. And we are very much part, I think, in this country of what is going on. So taken together, there are sort of a number of things that propelled me to go back and rethink relational comparison. And most immediately, the way I've been trying to engage with India in relation to South Africa is actually very different from the direct connections with East Asia that I was able to draw on and trace in the first phase of my research. And for a while, I've had a hunch that what I need is something closer to conjunctural comparison. And I dangled the idea at the AAG last year. And so this lecture is kind of a road test. And I don't know how it's going to work out, but it's... So the second thing that sort of propelled me to go back was actually discomfort with my arguments about East Asia. And also growing discomfort with the way these arguments have been picked up and used to make much more general claims than I did about accumulation without dispossession. And I can't go into detail in this lecture on this issue, except to say that I am really convinced that my own analysis was insufficiently conjunctural, and I plan to go back and revisit it in future. And more broadly, what is sort of driving me on here is that it's the question of not just what it means to theorize from the South, although of course I think that's hugely important, but it seems to me the whole question of the imperative for really pressing on what Coronial is calling for, which is an understanding of of the world as deeply interconnected and of different regions of the world as mutually constituted, and of how these kinds of understandings of interrelations and connections that are not obvious might help to denaturalize not only dispossession, but also nationalisms and other issues, as well as to open up and maybe illuminate possibilities for alliances. Okay, so I want to switch now to the question of what is the relational in relational comparison. And I actually had, and I have to take a sip at this point. So, I actually have to start with a mea culpa. And an absolutely major lacuna in my work on relational comparison was my failure to engage with Philip McMichael's concept of incorporated comparison that he laid out in 1990. And what McMichael does that's incredibly useful is he distinguishes in careful detail three distinctive comparative analytics. The first is positivist claims to analytical rigor. Second is what he called, it is encompassing comparison. And this is actually the language of Charles Tilly, who talked about the need to conjure up large processes in order to explain variations among cases as consequences of their relationship with this whole. And McMichael makes the point that what Wallerstein is doing in World Systems Approach is also an encompassing approach, even though he refuses comparison as such. And what McMichael then does is he posits an alternative that he calls incorporated comparison, which draws on Marx's method of developing concrete concepts as the product of multiple relations and determinations. So instead of leaping directly to a general claim, the argument about the need to understand carefully these multiple relations and determinations that enter into the constitution of larger processes. And what he lets us see is how there's a very fundamental difference between a totality that is presented as an empirical claim or a conceptual presumption, as opposed to what he's doing, which is what he calls a conceptual procedure in world historical analysis. Now, there are obviously very close affinities between incorporated comparison and relational comparison. And I think the first thing is that we draw on the same distinctions amongst different strategies of comparison. And I have this horrible feeling that I probably plagiarized. I probably through some residual memory, was using these distinctions. And actually, I met Phil at a conference several years ago, and I apologized to him, and he said he forgave me, and that we decided that we'd write a paper together. So the other thing is we're also drawing on a very similar reading of Marx's method and working with closely related conceptions of dialectics in non-teleological ways. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. There are, however, ways in which I think incorporated comparison and relational comparison are different, and they derive really from conceptions of space and time. And Phil and I actually had a very interesting conversation about this, which is Lefebvre was published in 1991. His work on incorporated comparison was published in 1990. And so the whole question of how a critical relational understanding of the production of space changes incorporated comparison is something we're both deeply interested in. So, and it turns around conceptions of space and time. So for the original, in his original formulation of incorporated comparison, he argued that it could take two forms. One, a multiple form in which instances are analyzed as products of a continuously evolving process in and across time, and then a singular form which analyzes variation in or across space within a world historical conjuncture. Now, relational comparison, as I understood it, refuses this separation of space and time, and it draws on Lefebvre in three key ways. First, most obviously, a relational conception of the production of space, a refusal to separate space-time, and also, very importantly, Lefebvre's regressive progressive method as what I read as a spatialized instantiation of Marx's method of multiple relations and determinations. But secondly, there are other aspects of Lefebvre's work that I think are really important. The second is a focus on everyday life and praxis. And this is why critical ethnography, as I see it, is intimately connected with relational comparison. And thirdly is Lefebvre's insistence on moving away from understanding capitalism in terms of the capital-labor relation and going back to a neglected piece of Marx, which is the Trinity formula, which includes land and nature. And it's actually this dimension of Lefebvre that Fernando Coronil picks up in his critique of diffusionist understandings. Now, at the same time, having laid out the affinities and differences, what burst upon me recently, before I could rewrite the paper, is that actually incorporated comparison and relational comparison are actually complementary. And if I had to give a really quick definition, okay, so what do you mean by conjunctural comparison? Because people have been asking me at this stage, and I kind of, whoa. But if I were to have to give a really quick, crisp definition, I'd say conjunctural comparison equals incorporated comparison plus relational comparison. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to follow through as concisely as I would like to on this. This is a pencil scribble at the bottom of my note. But before doing that, I want to turn to the question of dialectics and what it means to work with an open conception of dialectics that is neither teleological nor totalizing. And my understanding of Marx and my understanding of dialectics draws directly on Bertel Ollmann's exposition of what Marx did and did not take from Hegel. And in Ollmann's reading, first of all, Marx did not just render Hegel's idealism material. Rather, he took from Hegel the philosophy of internal relations and rejected just about everything else. And what I want to do now is give a quick summary of dialectics understood in terms of the philosophy of internal relations, and I'll explain where this summary comes from in a minute. So first is a focus on processes and not things. It's an ontological principle that elements, things, structures do not exist prior to the processes and relations that create, sustain, or undermine them. Secondly, dialectics forces us always to ask of everything or event, by what process was it constituted and how is it sustained? Third, Things and systems that many regard as irreducible are seen in dialectical thought as internally contradictory by virtue of the multiple processes that constitute them. And a contradiction here refers to a union of two or more internally related processes that constitute them. 4, things are always assumed to be internally heterogeneous, i.e. contradictory at every level. There are no irreducible building blocks and all categories are capable of dissolution. 5, parts and wholes are mutually constitutive of each other. But I want to read here a short quote from Ullmann, who says, whereas Hegel offers a large assortment of terms in which he attempts to capture the whole or the totality, absolute idea, spirit, God, universal truth. Marx does not offer any. Rather, he focuses on the internal relation of the tie between parts, whatever parts, and not on the function of the whole qua whole in clarifying these ties. And I think that's a hugely important point. And he goes on to say, really interesting, Spinoza and Hegel devote considerable attention to what they take to be the totality, whereas Leibniz and Marx do not. Number 6, ongoing change and transformation is inherent and holds out possibilities. And here again, I want to quote from Ullmann. With dialectics, we are made to question what kinds of changes are already occurring and what kind of changes are possible. The dialectic is revolutionary, as Bertolt Brecht points out, because it helps to pose such questions in a manner that makes effective that action possible. And this, for me, is the key stakes in thinking in terms of dialectics. Finally, dialectical inquiry is itself a process that produces concepts, abstractions, institutionalized structures of knowledge. But it does so in a way that relations between the researcher and the researched are not that of an outsider looking in on the researched as an object, but between two active subjects, each of whom internalizes something from the other by virtue of the processes that connect them. And more generally, there's no Archimedean point from which knowledge can be produced. And related to this, dialectical inquiry necessarily incorporates ethical, moral, and political choices and values into its own process and sees its constructed knowledges as discourses in the play of power. Now, this is the point at which I want to bring David Harvey into the conversation. And the summary of dialectics that I've just given you through internal relations, in fact, comes pretty directly from David Harvey's Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Difference, which, as Eric Shepard points out, he regards as his finest work on dialectics. Harvey draws very directly on Ullmann. And it's important to note here, actually, that very few Marxists think in terms of internal relations. Ullmann identifies Lukács, Lefebvre, and Karol Kosek, no relation of our beloved colleague Jake Kosek, on whom Phil McMichael interestingly draws. What Harvey adds to this, very importantly, is a refusal to separate space and time that comes directly from Lefebvre, although he insists also on the importance of Leibniz. And here's what Harvey says. He says, and this was part of his definition that I took out in order. Never mind. He said, space and time are not external to processes, but are contained within them. Multiple spaces and times are implicated in different processes. These processes all produce their own forms of space and time. Processes do not operate in, but actively construct space and time, and in so doing, define distinctive scales for their development. Now, what then happens is a very interesting move that Harvey makes, because clearly, if you think in terms of internal relations, there are methodological challenges to all of this. And what Harvey does in sort of responding to the methodological challenges, he stakes out, and I quote, a commitment to parsimony and generality with respect to processes, although not to things and systems. And what he's doing here is he's responding to those who think that dialectics derived from a philosophy of internal relations just immediately dunks you into kind of a giant bowl of spaghetti from which you will never ever claw your way out. And what he is doing here, and let me quote how he's trying to deal with this. He says dialectics does, this is his emphasis, does seek a path towards a certain kind of ontological security or reductionism. Not a reductionism to things, but to an understanding of common generative processes and relations. In this way, we can conceive, for example, listen up here, of a common process of capital circulation giving rise to an infinite variety of physical city landscapes and social forms. And this is where I differ really sharply from Harvey, even though we both subscribe to Ullmann's interpretation of dialectics in terms of internal relations, and even though we both read Ullmann through a Lefebvrean lens that refuses to separate space and time. And it seems to me precisely what he's proposing here is what McMichael and Tilly call encompassing comparison, i.e. positing a general process of which specific cases are simply variations. And it also embodies a tendency to gloss over specific parts and their interconnections and to give short shrift, as Ullmann puts it, to the complex mediations on presumptions that they are simply, or maybe even first and foremost, the effects of this common generative process. And Ullmann comments that the problem is that dialectical thinkers often play down or ignore parts and details in deference to making their generalizations about the whole, and also that they have a tendency to move too quickly to the bottom line to push the germ of a development to its finished form. This results from not giving enough attention to the complex mediations, and I would say spatio-historical mediations, that make up the joints of any social problem. Now, what Harvey's also doing is he's dismissing the possibility that close attention to a part or to relations between them could reshape understandings of these general processes. In other words, he's making no allowance for differences to be constitutive. And of course, it's on exactly these grounds that other feminists have also taken Harvey to task, and most notably and most incisively, Cindy Katz, as well as Melissa Wright in the Harvey Reader. And it seems to me that it's exactly this critique that they're picking up on. But, you know, a number of other feminist geographers have complained about the way Harvey strips away race, gender, sexuality, and so forth from class. And so I think that what's at stake here are an important set of methodological questions. And what I want to argue, that it seems to me that an incorporated / relational / conjunctural approach is actually fully capable of making general claims, but in terms that are different from either a positivist approach or an encompassing approach. So a positivist approach makes general claims on the basis of statistical representativeness. An encompassing approach makes general claims on the presumption that one already knows what the processes are. Whereas the kind of approach, the incorporated conjunctural relational, turns crucially around, here is where Marx's method is so crucial, and as Stuart Hall lays it out very clearly in his wonderful reading of the 1857 Introduction to the Grundrisse, of advancing from the abstract to the concrete in the sense of a concrete concept that is adequate to the concrete in history. And it seems to me that in any such method, a dialectical conception of articulation is crucial. And that this is where there, as with relationality, there are many different conceptions of articulation out there. And I think it's important to distinguish the uses of articulation by Althusser, by early Laclau, by Laclau and Mouffe, by Stuart Hall. And I think what's really important and what we need if we're going to use Marx's method in this way is also an understanding of articulation as part of a dialectical process. Now, the political stakes in all of this, I think, are quite significant, because for Harvey, they turn around the imperative to actually strip away difference and to sort of lay out the bare bones of class in order to reveal the inner workings and contradictions of capitalism. And the presumption here is that once people can understand what capitalism is all about and how it's working, that then these divisive differences can be sort of overcome. And on the other hand, there are those of us who think that constitutive differences are actually absolutely crucial to any project of forging alliances across registers of difference, as well as to identifying slippages, openings, contradictions, and possibilities. Now, what I'm going to do is just very quickly bring these arguments into conversation with both the urban studies debates and the subaltern studies debates, and sort of make a series of just very quick suggestions about what seem to me some interesting and productive ways forward. So first of all, I think there are just really clear parallels between what's going on in my differences with Harvey and the differences of so many others, and what is happening in the urban studies debates. And there, on the one hand, what you have are those who assert a common generative processes of which particular cases are variations. And in different ways, it seems to me, this could be said of Brenner and Schmidt, of Merrifield, of Stolper and Scott in the urban studies debate, and also of Vivek Chibber in the subaltern studies debate. But I'll come back to that in a minute. But like Harvey, what they're doing, in effect, is they're working with a form of encompassing comparison in terms of the generality, in terms of asserting the generality of their analyses. And at the same time, what Kate Derrickson is calling urbanization 2, or urbanization from below, is really proponents of this, of what she's calling urbanization from below, are in effect emphasizing the importance of constitutive processes, but also emphasizing the importance of relationality. But this is where it seems to me that it's very important to distinguish different concepts of relationality. And Jane Jacobs has pointed out that there are urban geographies making claims to relational thinking that are radically incompatible and live not in relation to one another, but in parallel universes. And it seems to me what she's doing is distinguishing here between the relational approach to comparison of cities advocated, for instance, by Kevin Ward, and what she sees as a more radically post-structural topology of urban relations in terms of assemblage. But, you know, I would argue that, one can add here that there are, even within post-structuralist analyses, there really are, again, different concepts of relationality at play. And that this is really evident in the differences between Jenny Robinson's work around assemblage and Ananya Roy's work around deconstruction. And I'd argue that beyond these debates, the meanings that Harvey, McMichael, and I are attaching to relationality in terms of a philosophy of internal relations are different from all of these. And that I think we really need to think carefully about what are these different conceptions of relationality and what are the political stakes, most importantly, in them. So I really do, though, think there are some close affinities between what I'm trying to do and what Jenny and Ananya are doing. And most obviously, I think we're all very deeply suspicious of efforts to leap too quickly to assert overarching processes. And I think we're very deeply committed to an approach that is very closely attentive to the constitutive processes arising out of the realms of everyday life. But I think there are also some distinctive differences and tensions that are potentially productive and that actually open up some very interesting questions. And in the written version of this paper, I'll try to spell out more fully what these are. But Ananya and I have already sort of started a discussion. And I do really think that it's important to carry this forward in thinking about what are first and foremost the political stakes. And we had a quick chat after the Territories of Poverty session yesterday, in which I think we just both immediately said, okay, what are here are differences, what are the political stakes? So yeah, I'm calling for going back actually to an early, if you go back to 2008, there was an issue of Environment and Planning A on dialectics in relation to various forms of post-structuralist analysis. And I think it would be really interesting to go back to that debate, but sort of with an understanding with a non-teleological understanding of dialectics, and with an understanding of how dialectics can and do mean very different things in different contexts. But overall, I think what I'm trying to say here is that the arguments cast in terms of Marxism versus post-structuralism, post-colonialism really need to be rethought quite radically, because I think they caricature both and are unhelpful. Now, I just very quickly, because this has gone on longer than I meant it to, very quickly want to say something about the subaltern studies debates. And on the one hand, Vivek Chibber, I think, can very easily be sort of be seen as making encompassing kinds of claims. And he says that. I mean, there's a quote where he says exactly that, and I'll have it in the written version. But I must say that I myself have some severe misgivings about Dipesh Chakrabarty's analysis cast in terms of History 1 and History 2. That I'm not going to actually, because I am at an hour and I promised that I would be done by then. But I promise in the written version I will lay this out. But if anybody wants to ask a question, I'd be. So, and here's where I want to start concluding. It seems to me, and I'll just make one point here. It seems to me that what Chakrabarty is doing is he's talking about provincializing Europe and the West in terms of the idea of the West and Europe, rather than in terms of Europe in its historical specificity. But the danger of doing this is that it helps to reinscribe a diffusionist model, or it certainly doesn't do anything to dismantle it. And that here is where it seems to me that if we're going to think about conjunctural comparison as involving both a deep attention to critical ethnography and to a deeper historical understanding, a la Phil McMichael, that a very important part of what that deeper historical understanding has to be about is non-diffusionist understandings of capitalism. And that this is where I just have to say one more thing here, which is that it seems to me that one of the things I frankly find very problematic about the way post-colonial studies comes to be defined in terms of subaltern studies is that what subaltern studies does is it totally neglects the whole black radical tradition that since W.B. Du Bois and going on to C.L.R. James and Fanon and many others have argued that race and slavery are absolutely central to the constitution of capitalism right from the get-go. Cedric Robinson, who refused to separate race and capitalism, who argued right from the get-go they were part of each other. And it seems to me this is one of the dangers, as I see it, of this deracinated understanding of history 1 and shoving everything else into history 2. That what it detracts from is exactly the sort of the understandings of deep interconnected processes that will help us dismantle all the things that Fernando Coronel was calling for. And that what we really need to be doing is going back to that call and working very hard. And I think there are a bunch of very interesting recent efforts to think in these terms, which is what our group sort of started off reading, that we should be paying very close attention to. So one of the points I was going to make in terms of the Chiba-Chakrabarty debate is that without question, Chiba's attack on Chakrabarty is incredibly crude and wrong-headed, I think, in a lot of ways. But somebody who's made what I think is a very, a much more devastating critique, precisely because it's a sympathetic critique in some sense, is Vinay Gidwani. And what he's done that I think actually fits very well with the way I've been trying to argue is he starts out by putting Chakrabarty and Harvey in relation to, in conversation with one another. And he shows how, precisely given Harvey's insistence on moving so quickly to this broader general level of generality, that Harvey kind of knocks out Chakrabarty in this first round. But you know what Vinay then does is he himself says, look, there are also real problems with what Chakrabarty's doing, and he points to what he calls the flatness of History 1, and he notes that the problem, and I'm quoting him here, the problematic artifice of History 1 and History 2 would be unnecessary if capital were to be understood as, quote, a concrescence of multiple fractions and forces that are territorialized by power knowledge to produce the effect of an expressive whole that takes the name of capitalism. And he also argues that what this History 1, History 2 distinction is doing is that it's actually reiterating something very problematic in early subaltern studies, which is seeing subaltern the subaltern as ontologically autonomous of the elite conception of the world. And he's saying that this sort of carries over into Chakrabarty's text. And what's also really interesting for me is that having made this, brought Harvey and Chakrabarty into relation with one another, at this point what Vinay does is to go on to say that he thinks that Althusser's theory of structural domination, with its logic of overdetermination, offers a generative way out of the impasse. And I think one of the implications of what I'm arguing is that thinking about dialectics in terms of internal relations, in the way Harvey and Lefebvre do, although in very different ways, is very different from an Althusserian understanding. It's extremely different. And I think that there are actually some very important entailments of moving with one reading of Marx rather than another. I could go on at great length on this, but I'll stop. Part of my problem is that it's history as opposed to spatio-historical. And that for me what is really missing, and I get it that Chakrabarty is not just making a dichotomy, that it's a deconstructive analysis. And I mean, Vinay, of course, understands that deeply. But it does seem to me that the danger of sticking with these categories of H1 and H2, even if they're made more capacious, is precisely that what's missing are understandings of spatial interconnection, which I think is just crucial to any sort of, and that this is not just an analytical question, it's a political question. Really, it is trying to work out these arguments more fully. And I mean, what I couldn't get to is what I mean by conjunctural and what it means in practice. And so, I mean, what I'm really deeply working on now is how to, it's not thinking about India, South Africa. It's not, a cross-national comparison. It's saying there are vitally important things going on in interconnected ways there as well as in other regions of the world. And what would it take to think about them? And so this is where thinking in this way is different from what I did with the South Africa, East Asia connections, is precisely the need to work in a more historical way and thinking about India, South Africa in relation to one another. And that, for example, I mean, somebody whose work I used in my book explicitly, but I think is very generative, is Manu Goswami's Producing India, where she's arguing, whereas Ben Anderson argued that nationalism sort of diffused, started in the Americas, went to Europe, and then diffused to Asia and Africa. I mean, I think what's so brilliant about what Goswami is doing is she's saying, actually, in the period, the late 19th, early 20th century, high imperialism, high nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism were all working together in and through one another. That India and South Africa were both crucial parts of the British Empire in different ways, in addition to Gandhi and all of that. But, the more I've thought about India and South Africa, you can sort of see, and this is where the conjunctural piece comes in. If you think of decades through the 19th century, there are moments through the 19th century where there's a sort of a global conjuncture that is being constituted, in and through which South Africa are being constituted, but in different yet related ways. And it seems to me that getting at sort of contemporary questions of neoliberalism, extreme right-wing dynamics, etc., has to be understood both historically and conjuncturally. So, I mean, that's most immediately what I'm trying to think through. The other paper I'm working on is called What is the Concept of Subalternity Good For? And it is exactly engaging Spivak. And what I think is so interesting is that Spivak herself, is very upfront about when she wrote Can the Subaltern Speak? She had not read Gramsci. And she sort of perpetuates this profound misreading that Gramsci used the term subaltern as a code for proletariat, which is absolutely flat out, a misrepresentation in a consequential way. But what I think is really interesting about Spivak is that unlike Chakrabarty or Chatterjee, she has read Gramsci carefully now, and she's also read Fanon. And I actually think there are very interesting moves that Spivak has made. So this whole question, part of what this is all about is, how do you think about translating Gramsci's insights? And so here is where Spivak, I think, is very interesting. Chatterjee I have written about in terms of a critique of his notion of political and civil society. What, in terms of critical practice, does this offer? In what way is it different? No, it seems to me precisely the difference is this, and we really see it in South Africa. There's a part of the left that says, once I'm going to tell you what capitalism is. Once you understand capitalism properly, you can rise up and sort of march to, a wonderful socialist future, and get over race and all that stuff. And it's exactly this argument that I am really strongly opposed to. And that's exactly why I have been arguing about the fundamental importance of how the ways in which difference is, the importance of understanding how difference is constitutive, not just something to be stripped away.